I want you to imagine, just for a moment, a rule book.
Okay, a rule book.
Yeah, but not, a rule book for a board game or, like, a sport. I mean, a highly guarded, fiercely debated manuscript that dictates exactly how the entire global medical infrastructure sees you.
Right, the ultimate authority.
Exactly. It isn't just some abstract philosophy text. It is the absolute arbiter of your reality within the healthcare system. I mean, it determines whether the agonizing pain you feel is considered real.
And whether your insurance is actually going to pay for your treatment.
Yes, exactly. It dictates whether the specialist sitting across from you says, yes, I know exactly what this is, or if they just shrug, look at a checklist, and tell you that you don't quite fit the criteria for help.
Which happens way more often than people realize.
It really does. And for decades, that rulebook has been a massive, heavy, physical text. It was just a static snapshot of medical consensus that was totally locked in time.
Yeah, essentially frozen.
Right. But what happens when that foundational architecture gets torn down to the studs and just completely rebuilt? What happens when the medical establishment is forced to abandon those rigid checklists and design a system that can actually capture the really fluid, terrifying complexity of the human nervous system?
Well, you are describing, without exaggeration, the most consequential paradigm shift in modern medicine.
Oh, wow.
The most consequential.
I really believe that, yeah. Because when the foundational blueprint of global healthcare changes, every single downstream system has to rewire itself.
So, like, pharmaceutical research, therapy, all of it.
All of it. National healthcare budgets, individual therapy sessions. I mean, we're talking about rewriting the actual parameters of human pathology here.
And that is the exact terrain we are navigating today in this deep dive. We are looking at the monumental transition from the diagnostic manual known as ICD-10 to its much-anticipated successor, ICD-11.
It's a huge leap. It really is. And, today's stack of notes provides a high-level summary of this systemic shift. We're going to explore how new diagnoses are born, how outdated physical criteria are tossed out, and how the system is adapting to be, well, far more nuanced.
And we're focusing specifically on how this impacts eating disorders. Right?
Yes, exactly, because eating disorders have been one of the most notoriously misunderstood and, frankly, historically mistreated areas of medicine. So we're looking at how this new rulebook changes everything for those diagnoses. Okay, let's unpack this.
I'm ready.
Before we look at what specific eating disorders changed, we have to understand how the tool itself transformed. Our sources describe ICD-11 as a more flexible and digital tool compared to ICD-10.
Yeah, it's a completely different architecture.
Right, and I compare it to upgrading from a static, outdated paper roadmap to a dynamic digital GPS system. But, I mean, a flexible and digital tool sounds great for an IT department. How does that actually change the experience for someone sitting in a doctor's office?
What's fascinating here is that it allows the medical field to adapt to new research so much faster.
Faster than waiting decades for a new printed volume, I assume.
Exactly. I mean, ICD-10 was finalized in 1990. Think about the state of neuroscience, genetics, and psychiatry in 1990.
Oh, man. The Human Genome Project wasn't even done yet.
It wasn't even close. Functional neuroimaging was basically in its absolute infancy. Yet the entire global medical community locked its diagnostic criteria into this super rigid hierarchical print structure.
So if a doctor saw something new, they were just stuck.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
If a clinician noticed a new cluster of symptoms that didn't fit the 1990 text, it took decades of bureaucratic maneuvering to formally recognize it. It was a nightmare.
So how does ICD-11 fix that?
Well, the digital flexibility of ICD-11 means it is built on a relational database. It's an ontology. It actually connects concepts.
Meaning it maps the relationships between symptoms, rather than just forcing them into isolated silos.
Precisely. So say we discover a new genetic marker or, a new neurological pathway that links a specific eating disorder to an autoimmune response.
Or a sensory issue, maybe?
Right, exactly. The digital architecture of ICD-11 allows the system to cross-reference those fields globally, instantly, without waiting 20 years for a new printed edition.
That's incredible. So it actually reflects the interconnected reality of human biology.
Yes, it stops forcing doctors to pretend the human body operates in completely independent, isolated departments, which, it obviously doesn't.
Right. So to bring it down to the level of the listener, say you or a loved one is sitting in the paper gown, terrified and looking for answers. The old ICD-10 was basically like trying to navigate a sprawling modern metropolis using a paper map printed in 1990.
with half the roads missing.
Exactly. Half the highways you're driving on aren't even drawn on the map, so the system insists you are driving through a field. The doctor looks at the map, looks at you, and says, "Sorry, you don't exist here."
Which is an awful thing to hear from a medical professional.
Completely. So ICD-11 is the live GPS that actually recognizes the roads that have been built over the last 30 years of clinical research. And that means the chance of you slipping through the cracks decreases dramatically.
And when you are driving on a road that the medical system refuses to acknowledge, you end up in what I like to call the diagnostic wasteland.
The diagnostic wasteland.
Yeah.
Yeah, that brings us to one of the most critical structural changes in the eating disorder criteria of ICD-11.
The eradication of the unspecific categories.
Yes, the infamous medical junk drawer. EDOS eating disorder not otherwise specified, or OSFED and other iterations. We know that historically, if you didn't perfectly map onto the rigid 1990 criteria for anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa, you were thrown into this vague catch-all bucket.
Which was just a clinical failure of alarming proportions.
I want to explore the systemic fallout of that, actually. Why was that unspecific label such a disaster for patients?
Well, statistically, the junk drawer became the most common diagnosis.
Wait, really? The most common?
Yes, by far. And when the vast majority of patients seeking treatment for severe, life-threatening eating disorders are being diagnosed with an unspecified condition, your diagnostic tool is completely broken.
I mean, that just shows your specific categories are way too narrowly defined, right?
Exactly. They were so unrealistic that almost no actual human beings fit into them perfectly.
So what does this all mean for the patients who previously just had an unspecific label? Because the economic and psychological consequences of that had to be devastating.
Oh, they were. From an insurance standpoint, if your chart says eating disorder unspecified, insurance companies look at that and see a massive loophole.
They see a lack of medical necessity.
Right. They argue, well, it's unspecified, so we aren't going to authorize 6 weeks of intensive inpatient therapy.
That is infuriating. But I imagine the psychological toll is even worse.
It's arguably much more insidious. You are dealing with a population of patients already battling intense shame, secrecy, and, a lot of self-doubt.
Right. They already feel like they aren't sick enough.
Exactly. So when a medical authority figure essentially tells them, your suffering doesn't quite match our textbook, so here's this vague label, it reinforces the pathology of the illness.
It totally invalidates them. It shoves them into a junk drawer.
It does. But ICD-11 attempts to dismantle this by formally elevating binge eating disorder, or BEDI, and avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, ARFID, to fully independent primary diagnostic status.
Okay, let's dig into the mechanisms of that elevation, starting with BIDI, because for a really long time, the medical establishment and certainly the broader culture just dismissed binge eating as a lack of willpower.
Or moral failing, yeah.
Right. Or just a byproduct of modern hyperpalatable diets. So what is the actual clinical and neurobiological distinction that forces ICD-11 to say, no, this is a distinct standalone psychiatric illness?
The distinction lies in the neurocircuitry of reward and a really profound sense of dissociation. Binge eating disorder is not synonymous with overeating at a holiday dinner.
Right. It's not just having a second slice of pie.
Not at all. Clinically, we are looking at episodes characterized by an acute, terrifying loss of control. The patient often describes it as a fugue state.
A fugue state, like they're totally disconnected from their body.
Yes. Neurologically, the pathways involved in BED closely mirror the dopamine reward circuitry seen in substance use disorders. We are looking at a dysregulation in the brain's executive functioning.
So the prefrontal cortex, the part that applies the brakes, is failing.
Exactly, while the reward center, the striatum, is essentially hijacked.
Wow. So elevating this to a standalone diagnosis in ICD-11 forces clinicians to stop treating it as a behavioral quirk. They have to start treating it as a serious neurobiological dysregulation.
Which is huge because it mandates targeted therapies.
Right.
That could be specific psychopharmacology, targeting those dopamine pathways, or specialized cognitive therapies.
Rather than just handing the patient a diet plan, which I know happened for decades.
Handing a patient with BED a restrictive diet plan is deeply iatrogenic.
Iatrogenic meaning it's a medical treatment that actively causes harm.
Right. Precisely. It directly fuels the cycle of restriction and binging. By isolating BED as an independent diagnosis, ICD-11 builds a firewall against that kind of clinical malpractice.
It gives them a real name and a real treatment path based on robust research. That is incredible psychological relief.
It really is. It signals globally that this pathology requires its own specific evidence-based intervention protocols.
And that exact same logic of clinical validation applies to the other newly independent heavyweight, ARFID.
Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder.
Yes. Now, we are going to plunge into the deep end of the sensory and neurological drivers of ARFID in a minute, but just structurally, separating ARFD from the picky eating stereotype or the anorexia umbrella is a massive pivot.
It is a pivot that redefines the parameters of starvation, honestly.
How so?
Well, under the old regime, if a patient presented with severe malnutrition, dramatic weight loss, and an outright refusal to eat solid foods, the immediate, almost reflexive assumption was anorexia nervosa.
The clinician would just assume it was about body image.
Exactly. They would spend months searching for the underlying body dysmorphia, the fear of weight gain, the drive for thinness, and if those elements weren't there, the clinician was just lost.
So ARFID finally provides the coordinates for that lost territory.
It does. It says, yes, this person is starving, and yes, it is psychological, but it has absolutely zero to do with body image.
That structural shift naturally pulls us toward what is, in my opinion, the most radical transformation in the entire eating disorder section of ICD-11. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, because giving these disorders their own names is crucial, but the actual criteria used to define what constitutes an eating disorder have undergone an aggressive modernization. We are seeing a major shift away from purely physical metrics.
Which is so overdue. The old ICD-10 relied heavily on very strict weight limits.
And specific biological failures. Most notably, amenorrhea, the loss of a menstrual cycle. I want to unpack this because relying on a rigid weight limit to diagnose a psychological disorder is fundamentally absurd.
It's a legacy of an era when psychiatry was desperately trying to legitimize itself through observable, measurable, physical metrics.
Right, it's like a mechanic analogy. Imagine you drive your car into the shop and the engine is knocking, smoke is pouring out of the hood, oil is leaking all over the floor.
The car is clearly dying.
Yes, but the mechanic just stares at the dashboard, sees that the check engine light hasn't specifically illuminated yet, and says, well, the manual says we can't diagnose an engine failure without the light. Come back when it turns on.
That is exactly what the medical system was doing.
You're waiting for the biological hardware to completely shut down before you admit the neurological software is corrupted. It's insane.
To take your mechanic analogy further, the old ICD-10 was basically telling the mechanic they are only allowed to look at the exhaust pipe, completely ignoring the onboard computer system that's actually misfiring.
Exactly. So let's look at the BMI, the body mass index, because that was heavily utilized as a diagnostic threshold, right?
Heavily. The insistence that a patient had to fall below a very specific, statistically arbitrary BMI threshold to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa ignored the physiological reality of starvation.
Because the body doesn't know its BMI.
Right. The human brain does not know what its BMI is. The brain only knows whether it's receiving adequate energy.
This brings up the critical concept of atypical anorexia, which ICD-11 accommodates much more effectively.
Which is a lifesaver for so many people.
Right, because if you have someone who starts at a higher weight and they engage in severe extreme restriction, they might lose a massive percentage of their body mass. Their body is functionally starving.
Yes, their organs are under the exact same stress as someone who is clinically emaciated.
So relying on a rigid weight number just excludes vast swaths of people who are suffering.
And often, they are under more stress, paradoxically. We see patients who technically fall into a normal or even overweight BMI category who are exhibiting profound physiological markers of starvation.
Like what kind of markers?
We are talking about severe bradycardia, dangerously low heart rates, electrolyte imbalances that can trigger sudden cardiac arrest, and skyrocketing liver enzymes as the body begins cannibalizing its own tissues for energy.
But under the old, rigid systems.
Under those outdated systems, these patients were frequently praised for their weight loss by the very medical professionals who should have been treating their life-threatening illness.
Praising the symptom of the disease. That is the ultimate betrayal by the medical system.
It truly is. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, ICD-11's shift towards clinically relevant assessments removes that arbitrary BMI floor.
But what do they look at instead?
It demands that clinicians look at the patient's holistic clinical picture, the velocity of weight loss, the severity of the restriction, and the mental state, rather than just the final number on the scale.
And that same dismantling of outdated biology applies to the removal of amenorrhea as a diagnostic requirement. I want to spend some time here because the insistence that a patient must lose their menstrual period to be considered truly anorexic seems deeply rooted in a very antiquated gendered view of mental illness.
It absolutely is.
Why was it ever there to begin with, and what is the systemic ripple effect of removing it?
Well, consider the historical context of how eating disorders were conceptualized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were viewed almost exclusively through the lens of female hysteria.
Oh, of course.
Hysteria. Yeah, it was deeply entangled with the female reproductive system and this supposed rejection of womanhood or maturation. Amenorrhea became the gold standard biological marker because it was the most obvious physical manifestation of that deeply flawed psychological theory.
But the clinical reality is that starvation impacts the endocrine system wildly differently from person to person, right?
Exactly. The biological mechanism behind amenorrhea is the suppression of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis due to an energy deficit. But that axis does not shut down uniformly.
So someone can be starving and still have a cycle.
Yes. Some women can be catastrophically malnourished and still maintain a cycle. Others might lose their cycle with only mild restriction. Furthermore, by making it a mandatory criterion, you immediately and automatically excluded massive demographics.
You exclude all men and boys entirely.
You exclude cisgender men, you exclude transgender women, you exclude postmenopausal women, you exclude prepubescent children.
Basically anyone who doesn't fit a very narrow profile.
And crucially, you exclude anyone on hormonal contraceptives that artificially regulate or simulate a cycle regardless of their nutritional state.
Wow. So the removal of amenorrhea in ICD-11 is the medical establishment formally decoupling the pathology of an eating disorder from the mechanics of the female reproductive system.
It is a profound modernization. It acknowledges that an eating disorder is a disorder of the mind and behavior, not a disorder of the ovaries.
And by stripping away these rigid physical barriers, the BMI cutoffs, the reproductive markers, you force the clinician to actually practice clinical psychiatry.
Exactly. You can't just run a checklist of physical measurements anymore.
You have to evaluate the cognitive distortions, the intense fear, the compulsive behaviors. You have to treat the mind.
Which is what they should have been doing all along.
Right. And this pivot from the physical to the neurological brings us to what I consider the most fascinating and, frankly, the most revolutionary aspect of the ICD-11 updates.
The neurobiological intersection.
Yes, because once we stop obsessing over body weight and body image as the only drivers of eating disorders, an entire hidden universe of pathology opens up. The new manual creates specific space to understand the intersection of eating disorders with sensory profiles and autism.
This is where we see the real integration of modern neurobiology into the diagnostic framework.
Can you untangle this for us? Because usually, when society talks about eating disorders, the conversation is entirely about body image. How does introducing sensory profiles and autism completely change our understanding of why someone might struggle with food?
This raises an important question regarding how we define the root causes of restrictive eating. For decades, the foundational assumption of restrictive eating was a drive for thinness.
Even when patients said they didn't care about their weight?
Right. Even when clinicians encountered patients who insisted they didn't care about their weight, the medical assumption was often that the patient was simply lacking insight or lying.
The assumption was that body dysmorphia is always the engine, even if it's hidden.
But the inclusion of ARFID and the explicit recognition of neurodivergence shatters that assumption. We need to dissect the actual mechanisms here.
Okay, let's do it. If a patient is restricting food to the point of hospitalization, but they don't have an ounce of body dysmorphia, what exactly is happening in their brain? Let's talk about the sensory profiles. How does a sensory processing difference translate into a life-threatening food avoidance?
To understand this, we have to look at interoception and the amygdala's response to sensory input.
Interoception.
Interoception is your brain's ability to perceive and interpret signals from within your own body. So hunger, fullness, heart rate, visceral sensations.
Got it.
In many neurodivergent individuals, particularly those on the autism spectrum, interoceptive processing is highly atypical. They might not register the physical sensation of hunger until it becomes a catastrophic, painful emergency.
Oh, wow. So they just don't feel it building up.
Right. Or, conversely, the sensation of fullness might feel agonizingly intense after only 2 bites.
So the biological hardware that tells you I need fuel or I have enough fuel is misfiring or calibrated completely differently. But what about the external sensory inputs? The texture, the smell, the temperature?
That is where the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, comes in. For a neurotypical person, biting into a mealy apple or encountering an unexpected slimy texture in a casserole might be unpleasant. You might spit it out.
Sure, it's gross, but you move on.
But for someone with a highly sensitive sensory profile, that same texture doesn't just register as unpleasant. It registers as an acute neurological threat.
A threat, like the brain thinks it's in danger.
Literally dangerous. The brain interprets the sensory input of that texture or smell as a massive threat. It triggers a full-blown autonomic fight-or-flight response. The heart races, adrenaline floods the system, the gastrointestinal tract just shuts down.
That is wild. It's basically a phobic response. The brain is reacting to a specific texture the same way it would react to, like, swallowing a spider.
Precisely. And when eating consistently triggers a panic response due to sensory overwhelm, the brain quickly learns to avoid food altogether.
That makes total sense. The restriction is a neurological defense mechanism against sensory trauma.
Exactly. Another presentation of ARFID is a fear of aversive consequences, like a paralyzing phobia of choking or vomiting. If a child with a hyperreactive nervous system chokes on a piece of meat, their brain might rewire itself overnight to classify all solid food as a lethal threat.
Which means the traditional treatments for eating disorders are not just ineffective, they're completely irrelevant.
Entirely irrelevant. If a clinician is operating under the old ICD-10 assumptions and they see a severely underweight autistic patient refusing food, they might put them in a traditional cognitive behavioral therapy group.
A group that focuses on challenging fat phobia, dismantling diet culture, and doing body acceptance mirror exercises.
Right, which would be like trying to treat a broken leg with cough syrup.
That's a great analogy.
And beyond being irrelevant, it is intensely alienating for the patient. They are sitting in a therapy group being told to stop worrying about their waistline, while their actual daily reality is a terrifying battle against their own sensory processing system.
That sounds like torture.
It is. By explicitly linking ARFID to sensory profiles in autism, ICD-11 redirects the clinical pathway. It tells practitioners the treatment needs to be sensory-based.
So, treating the nervous system instead of just the psychology.
Yes, we need occupational therapists, we need nervous system regulation techniques, we need slow, methodical, systematic desensitization to textures and smells. We need to work in tandem with the patient's neurodivergence rather than fighting a phantom body dysmorphia that doesn't exist.
That is a monumental paradigm shift. It is the medical field finally expanding its vocabulary to match the patient's reality. And this broadening of the lens, this willingness to step outside the narrow historical definitions, naturally leads us to the final major evolution we need to dissect today.
The lifespan approach.
Yes, because once you remove the rigid biological markers like menstruation, and once you incorporate diverse neurobiological drivers like sensory processing, you fundamentally alter the demographic profile of the disease. These diagnoses are no longer confined to a specific demographic. They are universal.
Right, and the modernized ICD-11 ensures a more precise diagnosis across all age groups, which dismantles the most pervasive and damaging stereotype in the realm of eating disorders.
The assumption that these illnesses are the exclusive domain of affluent adolescent girls.
Exactly.
That stereotype is so culturally entrenched. Every Lifetime movie, every magazine article from the 90s and 2000s cemented this image. And as we discussed, the old diagnostic criteria actively reinforced it.
They absolutely did.
If your diagnostic tool is heavily weighted toward adolescent social pressures and female reproductive milestones, you are building a net that is specifically designed to only catch teenage girls. Everyone else swims right through the holes.
And when you construct a diagnostic trap tailored to one specific demographic, you create systemic invisibility for everyone else.
So how does ICD-11 capture presentations at the extreme ends of the lifespan? Let's start with early childhood.
Well, we've talked about ARFD, which is frequently identified in very early childhood. Under less precise systems, a toddler on the autism spectrum who is dropping off the growth curve due to severe sensory aversions would just be labeled an extremely picky eater.
The pediatrician might just tell a parent, oh, they'll grow out of it, just wait until they're hungry enough.
Which is incredibly dangerous advice for a child whose interoceptive signaling is muted, because they literally might not feel hungry enough until they require a feeding tube.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's terrifying.
It is. So ICD-11 provides the clinical vocabulary to intervene early and accurately there. But let's swing the pendulum to the other end of the lifespan, the geriatric population.
That's a group you almost never hear talked about in this context.
Never. Eating disorders emerging or persisting in older adulthood are historically ignored, yet highly prevalent.
What does that pathology look like? Because I imagine the cultural trigger for a 65-year-old is vastly different from a 15-year-old.
The triggers are fundamentally different, yes, but the core mechanisms of seeking control or self-soothing through food are the same. In older adults, we frequently see the onset of severe restrictive eating or binge eating triggered by profound life transitions.
Like losing a spouse.
Exactly. The loss of a spouse, the sudden loss of agency and identity following retirement, or the terrifying reality of an aging, failing physical body.
There is a phenomenon often colloquially referred to in geriatrics as tea and toast syndrome,
Tea and toast syndrome, meaning they just survive on that.
basically. An
Yeah.
elderly patient essentially stops eating anything of nutritional value and just has a bit of tea and toast.
And I imagine under the old framework, that was just dismissed as a natural consequence of aging. Oh, grandma just doesn't have much of an appetite anymore. Or maybe it gets misdiagnosed as early onset dementia or purely clinical depression.
It is routinely misdiagnosed, but frequently it is a late-in-life manifestation of anorexia.
Driven by what, though? Driven by a desperate need to exert control over the one thing they still can, their food intake, while the rest of their autonomy is slipping away.
That is so heartbreaking.
It is. Or consider an older man struggling with crippling binge eating disorder, perhaps using food to self-medicate the isolation of his later years. Under the 1990s rulebook, he was invisible.
He didn't exist in the system.
Right. But the new, digital, flexible framework of ICD-11 is equipped to recognize his pathology without demanding he fit the psychological profile of a high school sophomore. It zooms the camera out to capture the entire continuum of human life.
It's a diagnostic system that finally respects the longevity and the complexity of human psychology. It
Yeah.
finally matches reality.
It really does.
As we synthesize all of this, the through line is just undeniable. This shift from ICD-10 to ICD-11 is not just an administrative housekeeping task. It is a fundamental evolution in empathy and hard science.
Absolutely.
I mean, we have seen the medical community tear down arbitrary physical thresholds that denied care to millions. We've seen the elevation of Beatty and ARFID out of the unspecified shadows and into the clinical light. We've traced the biological mechanisms that prove an eating disorder can be rooted in sensory processing and neurodivergence just as deeply as it can be rooted in body image. And we've watched the entire framework expand to protect people across every stage of their lives. It is a system that is finally attempting to model the patient rather than forcing the patient to model the system.
And that is the ultimate mandate of modern science, right? To constantly refine our models until they actually reflect reality. The ICD-11 is a massive leap forward in that refinement. But the very nature of this evolution, the fact that we had to aggressively discard so many deeply held medical assumptions to get here, it should keep the clinical world incredibly humble.
It really makes you wonder about the blind spots we still have today.
It should make everyone wonder. Because if a diagnostic architecture can shift this radically, if entire populations of patients with BED, ARFID, and sensory-driven disorders were languishing in the junk drawer of medicine for 30 years, simply because the rulebook was too rigid to see them, we have to ask the uncomfortable question.
What's next, basically?
Exactly. What incredibly common, deeply human neurobiological struggles are currently sitting in today's unspecified categories? What widespread pathologies are we currently dismissing as just stress or fatigue or picky eating purely because our current clinical vocabulary hasn't caught up to the biology? The ICD-11 is a triumph, but it is also a reminder that the medical junk drawer is rarely empty. It's just waiting for version 12 to finally give this suffering a name.